I am Hannah Whitaker, 29 years old, and on my wedding day, the front row was a row of empty chairs with our family name on them. The place cards barely fluttered when the harbor breeze moved through. The string quartet kept playing as if nothing had broken, but I could feel the break in my rib cage. Evan stood at the end of the aisle with that steady smile he wears when storms roll in, though he saw the empty seats too. I walked forward anyway, veil tugging at my shoulders, pretending the space beside me was not supposed to be filled by my parents. The photographer asked for a glance over my shoulder, and I gave him one that looked almost brave from a distance. When the champagne was poured, my phone started to vibrate against the silk of my dress until my hand shook. I looked down and saw the name Mom and the words, "We need to talk immediately." By the time the toasts began, there were 35 missed calls. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to smile through something that should have broken you, tap that like button, so I know I'm not alone. I grew up in a small New England house where the staircase creaked and the living room window caught the last of the afternoon sun, and from the beginning it was clear which daughter the light favored. Sophie had the upstairs bedroom with the wide window and the pretty view of the maple tree. My room was near the stairs, where every footfall rattled the picture frames. It wasn't cruelty, just a quiet sorting that happened without discussion. She collected gift bags and brand new dresses, and I collected gold stars and quiet nods. When I brought home straight A's, my father would say good and ask if Sophie needed gas money for practice. When I got the full scholarship, my mother smiled with relief and said it would help the family. I learned to hold my joy without expecting echoes. At 16, Sophie walked into the yard to confetti and a red car with a bow on the hood. I stood by with the bracelet I had braided myself and watched the bow get smaller in the rearview mirror. Those years shaped how I carried myself. Work hard, don't ask for anything extra. Try to leave every room better than you found it. I stayed busy first with textbooks and part-time jobs, then with late nights studying code repositories and meeting deadlines that didn't care how tired I was. When I moved to Boston, the harbor air felt bigger than the town I came from, and I built a life by the water, one careful brick at a time. The tech world spoke a language of timelines and deliverables, and I was good at both. I liked clear expectations, clean handoffs, the way a project plan could hold everyone to the same rules. On weekends, Evan and I walked the waterfront with coffee cups that warmed our hands and talked about work and paint colors and the kind of home we wanted. Solid, quiet hours. In that life, the yard where the red car once sat felt farther away, yet it never really disappeared. It lived in the way my shoulders tightened when the family group text chimed, and in the way I tried even then to believe each holiday might be a little different. I chose our wedding date the way I choose everything important early, carefully, with a list and a backup list. 10 months out, I sent the invitations and called my mother to avoid stepping on anything Sophie might have planned. She said she would make arrangements, and those words were so even, I took them as a promise. Evan booked the venue on Boston Harbor, the one with the white chairs and the clean line of the water beyond. My dress was simple and bright and fit, like something I could breathe in. My best friend from college, Lena, promised she would be right there at my elbow as I walked, and I believed her because that is what we say when years and memories have built a bridge between us. The closer we got to the day, the more I tried to ignore a small uneasiness that kept circling back and settling in my chest like a bird finding the same branch again and again. A week before the ceremony, my mother called with a voice so calm I thought I'd misheard her when she said the family couldn't miss Sophie's engagement party, not with the in-laws flying in and everything riding on appearances. She said it as if there were two events scheduled at the same time and a sensible person would know which mattered more. I looked at my calendar at the 10 months of planning that sat there in plain black letters and felt the tight little bird in my chest beat its wings. Later that afternoon, Lena called and explained that the engagement party would be full of people she needed to meet and that I would understand because I'm practical. I tried to be for a few hours, and then I set the phone down and sat in the quiet until the kettle clicked off and the kitchen went dim. I told Evan my parents were sorting flights because I wanted him to wake up on our wedding morning without that weight on his shoulders. The day itself was clear and blue, and the water lay flat and shining as if someone had ironed the harbor smooth just for us. The chairs faced the aisle, the flowers were pale and fresh, and the musicians found the notes right on time. Evan took my hands and steadied me the way he always does, and I let myself look at our friends at the co-workers who had come, at the distant cousins who waved and dabbed their eyes as if they had always been close. And then, like a tiny echo inside that perfect morning, I saw the space where my father should have stood, where my mother would have pressed a tissue into her palm and pretended she didn't need it, where my sister would have teased me about my veil and then fixed it with quick fingers. I walked anyway. I said yes, and when the room clapped, I smiled, and when the flutes were filled again, I lifted mine and felt the phone begin to hum against the silk. It was my mother's name, and the words were firm and urgent, and not at all what you send a daughter who just said I do. I didn't answer. I could feel something gathering just beyond the music, something that would ask me to choose the kind of woman I was going to be from this day forward, and I knew that when I finally picked up, nothing would sound the same. The messages on my phone didn't stop even after the last toast ended. While guests danced and the harbor lights rippled against the water, my mother's name kept lighting up the screen like a warning. I left the phone face down beside the cake table, trying to block out the vibration that kept pulsing through the fabric of my dress. Evan thought I was just overwhelmed from the day, and I nodded when he asked if I wanted to step outside for air. The night was too beautiful to let their absence ruin it, but every time I blinked, I saw those empty chairs again. When we finally returned home that night, the bouquet still tied with its white ribbon, I glanced at the screen. 35 missed calls. The last message read, "We need to talk immediately." I stared at it until the words blurred. My first thought was that something had gone wrong at the party, or maybe someone was hurt. But when I saw a new message from Jenna, my cousin, the truth settled in like cold air through an open window. "You won't believe this, Hannah," her text began. "They're talking about you at Sophie's party." I sank into the couch, my wedding dress pooled around me, the pins in my hair pressing into my scalp. Jenna's next message came fast. She said that when guests asked why my parents weren't at the wedding, my mother told them I had deliberately scheduled my ceremony on the same day as Sophie's engagement party just to steal attention. My father apparently nodded and said I'd been distant for years, so it wasn't surprising. I couldn't move. The living room felt smaller with every breath I took. For years, I'd believed that distance had come from growing up and building a life of my own. But hearing it twisted that belief into something else entirely, an accusation. They had rewritten the story of my absence to make me the selfish one. Then Jenna sent another line. "Lena's here too. She's telling people you were impossible about the guest list, said you didn't even want her at the wedding." The words stung more than I expected. Lena had been the friend who stayed up with me through college finals, who once carried me home after I fainted in the snow outside our dorm. And now she was sipping champagne beside my sister, adding her own lines to the fiction. I scrolled through the messages again, each sentence feeling heavier than the last. When the next text arrived, it was short. "They're panicking. Their caterer canceled last minute. Your mom told everyone you have connections in Boston's restaurant scene. She wants you to call around and fix it." That was it. 35 calls, all for help. Not one for regret, not one to ask how my wedding had gone. I set the phone down carefully on the table. The silence that followed felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. Evan came in from the balcony. His tie loosened, his eyes soft from wine and laughter. He didn't notice the phone at first. He sat beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulder, talking about how perfect the day had been, the vows, the harbor light, the way the music seemed to know what to play at just the right time. I nodded along, keeping my voice steady because I didn't want him to see the crack that had started forming. Later, when he finally drifted to sleep, I stayed up staring at the ceiling fan turning above us. Every revolution seemed to echo a single truth I'd been avoiding since childhood. The house I grew up in had never been a home built on fairness. It had been built on favorites, on who looked best in photos, on who could make my parents' lives easier to admire. And I realized that if I ever wanted peace, I'd have to stop expecting them to change. The next morning, sunlight poured through the curtains, painting the floor gold. My phone was still face down on the nightstand. I didn't pick it up. Instead, I went into the kitchen and started brewing coffee. The sound of the machine, steady and low, was the only thing keeping my mind quiet. I thought about my grandmother, the only person who had ever loved me without condition, and how she used to tell me that silence could be stronger than any reply. By afternoon, a new message appeared from Jenna. It came with a photo that made my stomach twist. In it, Sophie stood at her engagement party, smiling under a chandelier, a sapphire and diamond necklace gleaming around her neck. I recognized it instantly. It was the heirloom my grandmother had left to me in her will, the one she had pressed into my hands when her health began to fail, telling me it was meant to be worn on my wedding day as a reminder that love was built on truth, not vanity. Years ago, after her funeral, I had asked my mother where it was. She'd said the sapphire cracked, that it was worthless now, and she had tucked it away somewhere. I'd believed her because I didn't want to fight. Seeing that necklace now flawless and whole hanging from Sophie's throat under the warm lights of her party felt like being struck. I sat down slowly, the coffee forgotten the sound of traffic outside, fading into a distant hum. For a long time, I couldn't even cry. All I could think of was the way my grandmother had looked at me the last time I saw her, frail, but still sharp enough to see straight through pretense. "You understand value, Hannah," she had said. "Not price, but value." I had promised her I'd keep that necklace safe, not for its worth, but for what it symbolized. Now it was just another ornament in Sophie's collection, another thing my parents had handed to her without a thought. That night, after Evan fell asleep again, I opened my laptop. The blue light from the screen cast long shadows across the kitchen counter. I started taking screenshots of everything: my mother's messages, Jenna's texts, the photo of the necklace, even the unanswered calls. Each click of the mouse steadied my breathing. I wasn't sure what I'd do with them, only that I needed to preserve the truth before it could be rewritten. When I finished, I created a folder and named it For Later. It sounded small, but it felt like armor. I scrolled through my files until I found a scanned copy of my grandmother's will, one I had saved years ago, without really reading it. There it was, written in her familiar deliberate script: "The diamond and sapphire necklace shall belong to my granddaughter, Hannah Whitaker, to be given to her on her wedding day, as a reminder that love is the most important foundation of marriage." I read that line until it blurred the words swimming in front of me. There was no doubt. The necklace wasn't just a gift, it was a promise, a connection that had been stolen. For the first time, I let myself imagine what confrontation might look like. My mother would laugh and call me dramatic. My father would say I was tearing the family apart. Sophie would feign confusion, saying she thought it had always been hers. And Lena, if she ever dared to call again, would sigh and tell me to let it go for my own peace. The script had played out too many times before, and I was always the one written as difficult, so I decided I wouldn't speak, not yet. Silence could hold more weight than argument, and this time I would let time work for me. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet for a long while. Somewhere outside the harbor, wind brushed against the glass. Inside, I felt something shift. Not anger, not even sorrow, just a steady kind of resolve. I looked over at Evan, peaceful in his sleep, his face half lit by the glow from the streetlight. I thought about the promise we had made just hours earlier, and about how I didn't want our life to be defined by the people who had refused to show up for it. I whispered a quiet vow to myself: I would not let their choices stain what we were building. From that night on, I decided to stop waiting for apologies. I would live as if I'd never expect one. I would build my own peace, one careful layer at a time, until there was no room left for their chaos. I didn't know when or how, but I knew that someday the truth would find its way to the surface, and when it did, I would be ready. The morning after I created that folder, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The apartment was still and bright, filled with that quiet after a long storm. Evan had gone out to meet a client, leaving behind the faint scent of aftershave that somehow made the emptiness gentler. I turned my laptop back on, scrolling through each file I had saved the night before. Every screenshot, every message, every photo now lived in neat order proof of what had been taken and what still needed to be reclaimed. In the days that followed, I went back to work, as though nothing had changed. My coworkers congratulated me, brought small gifts, and asked to see photos of the ceremony. I smiled, answered their questions, and returned to my desk with practiced calm. The routine helped. It gave me something solid to hold on to, while everything else inside me felt uncertain. Still, every time I looked at my wedding ring, I remembered the empty row of seats and the necklace gleaming on Sophie's neck in that photograph. Work had always been my anchor. I poured myself into it completely. Deadlines and long hours were easier to face than silence. I began volunteering for projects others avoided: product launches, vendor contracts, late-night negotiations with overseas partners. When a senior director left the company, I took over her role, temporarily managing 2 teams at once. The days blurred into one another, but the exhaustion brought a strange kind of peace. At least here, effort was rewarded. Months passed, and the sting of that day dulled into something I could carry quietly. I stopped checking family messages. My parents didn't call, and I didn't reach out. On social media, Sophie's engagement photos flooded my feed: ballrooms, champagne designer gowns. I muted her account without anger, just a small decision that made breathing easier. Evan never asked about them again. He could tell when I didn't want to talk, and instead he filled our weekends with walks along the Charles River and quiet dinners at home. By spring, life began to take shape again. The company announced a major expansion, and I was promoted to senior manager. The email came through late on a Friday night, and I sat there for a long moment before telling anyone. When I finally did, my team clapped, and my supervisor shook my hand and said, "You've earned every bit of this, Hannah. You're the reason these projects don't fall apart." I smiled and thanked him, but my voice wavered a little as I thought of my grandmother and the necklace she'd entrusted to me. If she were still alive, I knew she would have been proud in the way only she could be, quietly, sincerely, without comparison to anyone else. With the promotion came better pay and a new sense of security. Evan and I decided to move closer to the river, into a condo with a wide balcony and tall windows that caught the morning light. We furnished it slowly, piece by piece, choosing items that felt like they belonged to us and no one else. Sometimes on Sundays, I'd sit out there with a blanket wrapped around my legs, watching sailboats drift across the water, and realize how far I'd come from the girl who used to listen to laughter spilling out of her sister's room. We started attending community events together, charity auctions, fundraisers, volunteer projects. Evan designed a renovation plan for a youth center downtown, and I helped secure sponsors from the tech sector. It became our shared mission. The project took nearly a year, and when it finally reopened, local papers ran stories about the transformation. I still remember one line from the article: "A project that began as a plan on paper turned into a symbol of hope." Seeing our names in print didn't bring pride so much as relief. For once, I was part of something built on kindness rather than obligation. Through that work, we began to meet people who valued us not for family name or connections, but for effort. The kind of people my grandmother would have liked: steady, honest, capable of seeing worth where it might have been overlooked. With them, I never felt like a shadow. The months turned into years. I didn't hear from my family, but I didn't expect to. Silence had become the distance I needed to keep my peace. I had even stopped wondering about the necklace until one evening when Jenna's name appeared on my phone again. It had been almost 2 years since the wedding, and her message was brief: "Sophie's getting married in New York next month. The necklace is being worn again." I stared at the words until the city outside my window seemed to blur. It wasn't anger that rose first. It was something colder, steadier, like water freezing in place. I thanked Jenna, set the phone down, and walked to the window. Across the river, the lights from downtown shimmered like scattered coins. I thought of my grandmother again, of her small hands closing around mine, and how she had trusted me with something that was never about appearance. That night, after Evan had gone to bed, I opened the old folder labeled "For Later." It had gathered dust in the corners of my desktop, but every file inside was exactly where I had left it. I clicked through them one by one, reading until the details no longer made me tremble. Then I opened a blank document and began to list names: attorneys, firms, specialists. I didn't know yet which of them I would choose, but I knew I would need someone sharp enough to cut through whatever defenses my parents had built around Sophie's lie. By the end of the week, I had narrowed it down to one: His name was Vincent Harper, a Boston attorney known for handling high-profile inheritance disputes. His reputation was for quiet efficiency rather than spectacle, which felt exactly right. I sent an email outlining the basics: my grandmother's will, the necklace, and my family's refusal to acknowledge it. He replied the next morning with a simple invitation to meet. When I arrived at his office, the building smelled faintly of old books and leather. Vincent was tall, silver-haired, with the calm of someone who had seen more arguments than most people could imagine. He listened without interrupting as I explained everything from the favoring that had started when I was a child to the stolen heirloom that had become Sophie's centerpiece. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "You've already done most of the work," he said. "Evidence, documentation, timeline, it's all there. What's missing is the delivery, and that he added is where timing matters most." His words lingered long after I left his office. Timing. I thought of my mother's calls on my wedding day, of the necklace glinting under a chandelier, of the years I'd spent waiting for them to do the right thing. Maybe patience had always been the right weapon. It just needed direction. Over the next few weeks, Vincent and I began assembling the case. He drafted a formal notice to my parents, citing the clause in the will that specifically named me as the rightful owner of the necklace. He attached the photo Jenna had sent and the scanned document signed by my grandmother's attorney years ago. Then he looked up and asked, "Do you want this handled quietly, or do you want it seen?" "Both," I answered. "Quiet at first, seen only when necessary." He nodded, as though he understood perfectly. Together, we decided on the date and time the notice would be delivered: the afternoon of Sophie's wedding, in the middle of the ceremony. Vincent said it would guarantee accountability. If they've built their reputation on appearance, he said, then truth arriving in front of cameras will be the one thing they can't hide from. When I got home that night, Evan was waiting on the balcony, a glass of wine in his hand. I joined him, watching the lights flicker on across the city. He looked over and asked, "Long day?" I nodded. I didn't tell him everything, not yet. I wanted him to see the outcome, not the battle. As we stood there, the air smelled faintly of rain. Somewhere far below, a ferry horn sounded on the river, deep and steady. I thought of all the years I had swallowed silence, and how strange it felt now to use that same silence as strength. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt prepared. The night grew darker, and the city lights softened. Evan slipped his arm around me, and we stayed like that for a long while, saying nothing. Inside my mind, the plan was already forming, careful, deliberate, unshakable. I didn't know how it would unfold, but I knew one thing for certain: when the truth finally reached them, it would arrive at the exact moment they least expected it. The weeks leading up to Sophie's wedding moved with a strange, steady rhythm. On the surface, everything around me felt ordinary: the morning commute through the city, the clatter of keyboards in the office, the quiet evenings when Evan and I sat on the balcony, watching lights reflect across the Charles River. But underneath it all, something had shifted. Every day felt like the quiet before a storm, the kind that builds out of sight until it breaks without warning. Vincent and I spoke often, refining every detail of the plan. He had a calm precision about him that steadied me. His office was filled with the smell of paper and coffee, and every time I stepped inside, the world outside seemed to slow down. We went through the evidence again and again: my grandmother's will, the photo of the necklace, my mother's texts. Each piece sat neatly in a folder labeled and numbered. Vincent never rushed me. He would ask short questions, make notes, and remind me that the truth didn't need embellishment. It only needed the right moment to appear. One afternoon, he leaned across his desk, sliding a copy of the formal notice toward me. "Once this is delivered," he said, "you can't take it back. They'll know exactly where it came from." I nodded, tracing the embossed seal at the bottom of the page. My grandmother's name was printed clearly in the clause, the words almost glowing against the paper. "The diamond and sapphire necklace shall belong to my granddaughter Hannah Whitaker, to be given to her on her wedding day." Reading it no longer made me tremble. It made me steady. Outside, winter was fading, and Boston was waking up from its long gray months. Evan noticed my quietness, but he didn't press. Instead, he focused on his architecture firm's new project, spending long evenings drafting designs at our dining table. We'd sit side by side, him sketching me, scrolling through documents, and the silence between us was comfortable. When he looked up, I smiled and told him I was helping Vincent finalize something for work. That wasn't entirely a lie. As Sophie's wedding approached, the story began to spread across social media. My parents posted photos from the rehearsal dinner, the sparkling chandeliers, the floral centerpieces, and of course Sophie smiling under soft lighting. Every caption read like a headline: "Our pride, our joy, our beautiful bride." I didn't comment or react. Each post only reminded me how practiced they were at creating perfection. They had no idea that within days that image would begin to crack. Vincent scheduled everything precisely. The legal notice would be delivered at 3:15 p.m., right as Sophie walked down the aisle at the Plaza Hotel in New York. He explained that the timing wasn't meant for cruelty, it was for clarity. When the truth lands in the light, he said it leaves no shadows for denial. He planned to email the documents to my parents, Sophie, and the hotel management, simultaneously followed by a physical delivery, signed and sealed. The night before the ceremony, I barely slept. The city outside was quiet rain tapping lightly against the windows. I sat on the couch watching the skyline blur in the mist, thinking about my grandmother. I could almost hear her voice again, soft, certain the way she always spoke when she wanted me to understand something deeply. She'd told me that patience was not weakness, that silence could hold more power than anger. For years I had lived by those words. Now they felt like a promise I was finally keeping. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and cold. Evan was leaving for a design meeting in Cambridge, unaware of what that day truly meant. He kissed me goodbye, his coat brushing against my shoulder, and said, "Don't work too hard today." I smiled and promised I wouldn't. As soon as the door closed, I sat down at my laptop. Vincent's message was waiting in my inbox, all set for 3:15. "Are you ready?" I typed back one word: "Yes." Hours passed slowly. I tried to read to Cook to distract myself, but everything felt distant. At 3:14, I stood by the window, the soft hum of the city rising below. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, Sophie was walking toward her future, wearing the necklace that had never belonged to her. The clock on my screen turned to 3:15. Vincent pressed send. I didn't see what happened firsthand, but I didn't need to. Within the hour, messages began to appear on social media. Whispers, photos, a single post from a journalist I knew through our charity work breaking legal notice served at Plaza Hotel wedding regarding disputed heirloom. Developing story. My phone began to buzz with messages, but I didn't answer any of them. I opened the window instead, letting the cold air in, and imagined the scene as it must have unfolded. The music, pausing guests, whispering my mother's expression, tightening my father's voice, rising in confusion. And Sophie, standing under the chandeliers, her hands frozen near her throat. At 3:47, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Her voice came through sharp and breathless. "Hannah, what have you done? You've humiliated your sister in front of hundreds of people." I stood by the window watching the light fade across the water. "I didn't humiliate her," I said quietly. "I told the truth." "You could have handled this privately," she snapped. "Do you have any idea what the guests are saying? The press is outside the hotel. Maybe they'll remember that before they steal something next time," I replied. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear voices in the background, my father muffled and angry, and someone crying. My mother's voice wavered softer now, but still edged with disbelief. "You've always been so resentful, Hannah. Couldn't you just let Sophie have her day?" Her words landed the same way they always had, but this time they didn't break me. "Do you remember my wedding?" I asked. "You weren't there. None of you were. I walked down that aisle alone while you toasted Sophie's engagement, and now you're angry because the truth caught up with you." She didn't respond. The line crackled faintly, the noise of the ballroom fading behind her. I could almost picture her face, the realization settling in the story unraveling. Finally she said, "You've changed." "No," I said softly. "I just stopped pretending." Then I ended the call. For a moment I stood there in silence, the phone still warm in my hand. Then I turned it off completely and placed it on the table beside me. Outside, the wind carried a faint scent of rain. The city kept moving as if nothing had happened, but inside me something settled. I didn't feel victory or regret, just quiet. That evening, Vincent called to confirm everything. The hotel had received the notice the documents had been acknowledged, and the press had already published their first reports. "It'll be loud for a while," he said. "Then it'll fade. But they won't forget it." I thanked him and told him I was grateful not for the spectacle, but for the truth finally standing on its own. After the call, I poured a glass of wine and stepped onto the balcony. Evan came home later than usual, tired but smiling. He joined me outside, wrapping his arm around my waist, unaware of the storm that had just passed miles away. We watched the river shimmer under the city lights until the chill sent us back inside. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the hum of distant traffic, I realized the silence that used to ache inside me had changed. It wasn't the kind born of being ignored. It was the kind that follows after you've finally been heard. And though I didn't know what would come next, how my parents would react, or how Sophie's world would shift, I knew one thing for certain: the truth was no longer buried. It was standing out in the open where it had always belonged. The next morning, before I even checked the headlines, I received a message from Vincent. It was brief. "They've responded. We'll talk soon." I set my phone down and took a deep breath. Whatever came after this, I was ready to face it. By morning, the story was everywhere. Headlines spread across news feeds and social media, each one slightly different, but all pointing to the same scene: a bride at the Plaza Hotel being asked to remove her necklace mid-ceremony because of a legal dispute. I didn't need to read beyond the first few lines. The words had a way of finding their own shape, traveling faster than I could follow. At the office, whispers trailed behind me, soft and uncertain. Most of my coworkers didn't know the details, only that my name had surfaced in connection to the incident. I kept my focus on the projects ahead of me, answering questions about deadlines instead of rumors. The hum of keyboards and muted phone calls became a barrier between me and the world outside. It wasn't shame that kept me quiet. It was the peace that comes after you've already told your side of the story. That evening, as I walked through the lobby of our building, my phone began to buzz again. Messages from old acquaintances, college classmates, even a few distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Some offered sympathy, others wanted to confirm the gossip. I read them all in silence, deleting most before they could take root in my thoughts. When I reached our apartment, Evan was sitting on the couch scrolling through his tablet. He looked up as soon as I stepped inside. "You're trending," he said gently, setting the tablet aside. I nodded. The corner of his mouth lifted in a faint smile. "You handled it better than most people ever could." I sank beside him, exhaling a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "I just wanted the truth to be seen," I said. He reached over, brushed a strand of hair behind my ear, and replied, "It was." The next few days unfolded like a slow echo. More articles appeared. Some measured, others sensational, but the core remained the same. Reporters called it the Whitaker wedding scandal, dissecting the details of family wealth inheritance and betrayal. They quoted Vincent's official statement, which was calm and factual. The rightful owner of the Whitaker family heirloom has exercised her legal rights as per the will of her late grandmother. That single sentence silenced much of the speculation. Still, the fallout for my family was swift. Through Jenna, I learned that Sophie's new in-laws, a family known for valuing discretion, had taken offense at the public embarrassment. The news had spread overseas within hours, and by the time the reception ended, half of their planned partnerships had been withdrawn. My parents tried to contain it, but the story had a life of its own. Sponsors backed out, friends distanced themselves, and the perfect image they'd curated for years began to crumble. Jenna called me one evening, her voice quiet but certain. "They're panicking," she said. "Your mother's been calling everyone she knows, trying to get the articles taken down. It's not working." I thanked her for letting me know, though I didn't ask for more. The details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the truth no longer lived in whispers behind closed doors. A few nights later, my mother's number flashed across my phone again. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. Her voice came through hoarse, strained from days of damage control. "Hannah, please," she began. "This has gone too far. You've humiliated all of us. Do you have any idea what we're living through?" I listened without interrupting. The same tone I'd known since childhood, the one that turned blame into pity, was still there. When she finally paused, I said softly, "You chose this, Mom, not me." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, as though my calmness unsettled her more than anger would have. "I was trying to protect the family," she said. "You were protecting Sophie," I replied. "You always have." The silence that followed was longer this time. I could hear the faint sound of my father's voice in the background, muffled, but agitated. My mother spoke again, quieter now. "You've made your point. What do you want from us?" "Nothing," I said. "Just honesty." Then I ended the call. That conversation became the last we had for a long time. I didn't block their numbers, but I didn't answer again either. There was nothing left to argue about. The truth had already done its work. Weeks passed, and slowly the attention faded. Other stories took its place, as they always do. But the impact lingered in subtle ways. My parents withdrew from their social circles, avoiding events they once lived for. Sophie's marriage grew tense under scrutiny, and soon her husband returned to Europe alone. Lena's name appeared in one of the reports about friends who contributed to false claims, and her company's reputation suffered for it. I didn't wish for any of it. It simply unfolded like gravity, pulling everything back into balance. Through it all, Vincent stayed in touch, finalizing the legal return of the necklace. He handled the paperwork with quiet precision, never asking for more than I could give. When the process was complete, he called to confirm the transfer. "It's done," he said. "They've complied fully." I thanked him and asked about his fee. He chuckled softly. "Let's call it settled," he said. "Justice doesn't always need a receipt." When I hung up, I found myself standing at the window again, the city lights reflecting off the glass. Evan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "It's over now," he whispered. But it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something quieter, a space opening where bitterness used to live. 2 weeks later, a courier delivered a small velvet box to our apartment. Inside lay the necklace, polished and gleaming under the soft light. The sapphire caught the color of the sky outside, deep and calm. There was a note attached, unsigned but written in my father's handwriting, "Return completed." I closed the box gently and set it on the table. For a long time I didn't touch it. I wanted to wait until the noise around it had truly settled before letting it back into my life. By the time our first wedding anniversary arrived, the world had mostly moved on. Evan planned a quiet dinner at home, candles flickering on the table, the air filled with the scent of rosemary and lemon. After we finished eating, he disappeared into the bedroom and came back holding the velvet box. "I think this belongs to you," he said with a small smile. He stood behind me, lifting the necklace with careful hands. When the clasp clicked into place and the cool weight touched my skin, a wave of memory passed through me, the sound of my grandmother's laughter, the warmth of her hand in mine. Evan leaned down and kissed my shoulder. "Looks like it's finally home," he whispered. I turned toward the mirror, the sapphire resting against my collarbone, shimmering like a drop of the ocean. It didn't feel like a trophy. It felt like peace, something quiet, earned, and lasting. We spent the rest of the evening talking about the future new project's travel plans, the life we were building brick by brick. The past no longer hovered between us. It had found its rightful place like a closed chapter on a shelf. Later that night, when I placed the necklace back in its box, I realized I wasn't protecting it anymore. I was simply keeping it safe the way my grandmother had wanted. Outside, the city was quiet. The river reflected the moon in long silver lines. I thought about the road that had led me here, every empty seat, every silence, every truth I'd had to face alone. And I understood finally that justice hadn't been about revenge. It had been about reclaiming myself. When I turned off the light, the necklace still shimmered faintly inside its box, catching the last trace of candlelight before the room went dark. The air felt lighter, almost new, as if the years of noise and pain had finally lifted. And though I didn't know whether my family would ever call again, I no longer waited for it. Some stories once told in full don't need to be reopened. They simply rest quiet, complete, and free. I reached for Evan's hand under the covers and felt his fingers intertwine with mine. "Happy anniversary," he murmured. "Happy anniversary," I whispered back, and for the first time in a long while, those words felt like home. Life settled into calmness again after the scandal faded from the headlines. The quiet that followed didn't feel empty this time. It felt earned. Evan and I went back to our routines: morning coffee by the window, evening walks through the park near our apartment, slow weekends spent working on his architectural sketches and my project proposals. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, there was still an undercurrent of reflection that hadn't gone away. Some nights I'd catch myself wondering how my family was handling the silence they'd created for themselves. Other times, I simply didn't think about them at all. Work became the easiest part of my world. The promotion that had once felt like a milestone now became a foundation for something bigger. My projects expanded into new markets, and my team grew. The younger analysts often came to me for advice, and I found myself repeating lessons I had learned the hard way. Stay patient, trust your preparation, and never let someone else's doubt shrink your ambition. The more I poured myself into the work, the more recognition followed, though I never sought it. One afternoon during a quarterly review meeting, my director called me aside. "Hannah," he said, handing me a folder with the company's seal embossed on the front, "you've been nominated for our National Leadership Award. Your team's performance last year was outstanding." I opened the folder and saw the nomination letter printed in neat formal language. It felt strange, gratifying, but also distant from the girl I used to be standing in the corner of her sister's birthday party clutching a handmade gift no one noticed. Evan celebrated by taking me to dinner at a small restaurant by the harbor. The table overlooked the water, and the lights of the city shimmered across the surface like scattered stars. He raised his glass and smiled. "You know," he said, "I think your grandmother would have been proud of this. Not just the award, but the way you carried yourself through everything." I looked out at the water and nodded. She used to say that dignity was quiet. I think I understand that now. He reached across the table, his hand warm around mine. "You didn't win by fighting loud," he said softly. "You won by standing still and letting them see what they did." The words stayed with me for a long time. Months passed and the seasons shifted again. The city turned green with spring, then bright with summer light. Evan's architectural firm earned a large project downtown, and I began mentoring 2 young women at work who reminded me of myself 10 years earlier, eager, focused, but unsure of their own worth. Helping them find their confidence felt like closing a circle I hadn't realized was still open. Around that same time, Jenna called for the first time in months. Her voice carried that familiar mix of empathy and caution. "You should know," she said, "your parents moved out of the old house. It's on the market now." I was quiet for a moment, picturing the house where so much of my childhood had unfolded. "Do you know why I asked?" "Mostly because of money," she said. "Your dad's company lost investors after the wedding incident. They've downsized everything. Sophie's been staying with them for a while." I thanked her for telling me and hung up, feeling the kind of calm you get when something you used to fear finally loses its power. The thought of that house sitting empty didn't hurt. It just felt like the end of something that had already been over for a long time. Later that week, I found the courage to drive by. The yard looked smaller than I remembered, the trees thinner. A for sale sign stood by the front steps, its corners flapping in the wind. I parked for a moment but didn't get out. Some ghosts don't need revisiting, they only need acknowledgement. After a while, I started the car and drove away, the rearview mirror catching the house one last time before it disappeared from sight. When I got home, Evan was in the kitchen sorting through sketches for his latest design. He looked up when I walked in, studying my face for a beat. "You went there, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. "It's for sale." He hesitated before asking, "How did it feel? Like I closed a door?" I said simply. He smiled a little and went back to his sketches. "Then it's probably time," he said. That night, as I stood on the balcony, watching the lights flicker across the Charles River, I thought about how strange healing can be. It doesn't arrive all at once, it shows up quietly in small confirmations that you're no longer standing where the pain began. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was careful, familiar. My first instinct was to set it aside, but curiosity won. Inside was a short note written by my mother. The paper was creased, the ink slightly smudged, as though it had been rewritten more than once. Hannah, we know there's no undoing what happened. I won't ask for forgiveness, only understanding. Your father is not well, and Sophie, she's learning the hard way what truth costs. Take care of yourself. Mom. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. There was no return address. For a long time, I stood by the window, staring out at the skyline, the hum of the city soft beneath it all. I didn't feel anger, only a kind of quiet closure. Sometimes people reach for peace when they realize silence has grown too heavy to carry. That night, Evan found me there, still holding the letter. From them, he asked. Yes, I said. He waited. What are you going to do? Nothing, I said finally. I think that's the answer. He nodded, wrapping his arms around me, and we stood like that until the city lights dimmed. Over the next few weeks, I thought less about the letter and more about what came next. My work was thriving, our lives were steady, and for the first time the future didn't feel like something I had to chase. It felt like something I was already living. In late summer, Evan surprised me with a weekend trip to Maine. We rented a small cabin by the water, the kind with creaky floorboards and wide windows that opened to the sea. The air smelled of pine and salt, and in the evenings the waves crashed softly against the rocks below. One night, sitting by the fire, Evan turned to me and said, "You know you never told me what you did with the necklace." I smiled faintly, looking at the flicker of light on the sapphire resting against my collarbone. "I keep it close," I said, "not as a reminder of them, but of her, and maybe of who I became because of it." He reached for my hand, and we sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between us. Outside, the tide shifted with the moon steady and unhurried. That weekend felt like a quiet promise, one that the rest of our lives would be built on something real. When we returned to Boston, I placed the necklace back in its box and set it on the dresser beside a framed photo of my grandmother. The light from the window caught on the sapphire, scattering small blue reflections across the wall. It felt like she was still there, watching over the life I had built, the peace I had fought for, without raising my voice. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the calm of the room. The war had ended, and what remained was clarity and understanding, that freedom sometimes looks like distance, and love sometimes means letting go completely. As I turned off the light, I felt a quiet certainty settle inside me. Whatever waited ahead, it would be faced with grace, the same way every storm before it had passed. And somewhere deep down, I knew this was not just the aftermath. It was the beginning of something entirely new. Autumn came early that year, sharp and quiet. The air turned crisp along the Charles River, and the trees outside our apartment shed their leaves in slow waves of color. Life had settled into a kind of peace I hadn't known before, unhurried, grounded. Work continued to grow, Evan's designs began gaining attention, and our days moved in rhythm. Yet beneath the calm, I could feel the faint hum of unfinished business, something that lived in the distance but hadn't completely faded. It had been months since I'd received that letter from my mother. I hadn't replied, and the silence between us had stretched long enough to become its own kind of conversation. Still, every so often I'd catch myself wondering if that letter had been an ending or a beginning they didn't know how to finish. One chilly afternoon, I was walking home from the office when my phone buzzed with a message from Jenna. It was brief. "You should see this." Attached was a screenshot from an online article. The headline read, "Former Executive Thomas Whitaker faces audit over mismanaged accounts." I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, the city noise falling away. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the words. When I got home, I found the full story. The company my father had worked for nearly 20 years was under review for financial discrepancies. He wasn't accused directly, but his name appeared in connection to multiple failed accounts. The article mentioned extended leave due to health issues. I sat at the kitchen table reading it twice, feeling a mix of sadness and inevitability. Evan came in from the balcony when he saw my expression. "What happened?" he asked, setting down his coffee mug. I turned the screen toward him. "It's my father. His company's being audited." He read the headline, then looked back at me. Do you think it's true? I think it's complicated, I said quietly. He's always been good at keeping things polished on the outside. Evan reached across the table and took my hand. You don't owe them anything, Hannah. Not their secrets, not their rescues. I know, I said, but it still hurts. Over the next few days, small updates appeared, statements from the company, rumors from business columns. None of it surprised me anymore. What did surprise me came a week later when I received a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hannah. The voice was softer than I remembered, but unmistakable. It was my mother. It's me. I stood still, my breath catching slightly. I know, I said. There was a pause. Your father isn't well, she continued. He's been in and out of the hospital. Stress, they say. The audit made everything worse. I waited. She exhaled shakily. He asks about you. He won't admit it, but he does. Sophie's here too. Things haven't been easy for her since everything. I could hear the weight in her voice, the fatigue, the unraveling of the life they had worked so hard to keep pristine. What do you want me to do with that information? I asked. Maybe nothing, she said. Maybe I just wanted you to know. There was another silence, longer this time, filled with everything neither of us could say. I finally spoke, my voice low. Mom, you made choices. So did I. We're living with them. Her tone softened. You sound like your grandmother when you say things like that. That name stopped me. It had been years since she'd mentioned my grandmother, and hearing it now felt like a bridge between past and present. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, I said. She didn't argue. Take care of yourself. Hannah, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Please. When the line went dead, I sat for a long time staring at the dark screen. I wasn't sure if that call had mended anything or simply marked another step away from the wreckage. But there was something about the way she'd said my grandmother's name. It felt like an unspoken apology, quiet and incomplete, yet real in its own way. That night I told Evan about the call. He listened without interruption, his expression calm. When I finished, he said, It sounds like she's finally beginning to see things clearly. Maybe, I replied, but clarity doesn't always come with change. He nodded, thoughtful. True, but sometimes it's enough just to know they're trying to understand. As winter approached, Boston grew colder and stiller. I kept busy with end-of-year projects and travel meetings, but the thought of my family lingered. The news about the audit eventually faded from the papers, replaced by fresher scandals, yet the ripples continued quietly. Jenna told me my parents had sold another property, that Sophie had taken a small job at a boutique outside of town. Their world had contracted. It wasn't revenge, it was gravity pulling everything back to truth. One evening after a long day at work, I returned home to find Evan setting the table for dinner. A box sat near my plate, wrapped in plain brown paper. I looked at him curious. It came this afternoon, he said. No return address. I opened it carefully. Inside was a small velvet pouch. My breath caught when I recognized the faint smell of cedar, the same kind of box my grandmother had kept in her bedroom. I loosened the drawstring and poured the contents into my hand. A delicate gold locket slid out its surface, slightly worn. When I opened it, a tiny folded note was tucked inside. For you. She wanted you to have this too. There was no signature, but I knew who it was from. I sat down slowly, the weight of the locket warm in my palm. Inside the small oval frame was a faded photograph my grandmother, standing in her garden, smiling in the afternoon light. Evan watched quietly. From your mom, he asked. I nodded. I think so. Or maybe from Sophie, through her. Are you going to respond? I closed the locket gently, letting it rest in my hand. Not yet, I said. Some things are better felt than spoken. That night I placed the locket beside the necklace on the dresser, the sapphire catching the soft glow from the lamp. The two pieces of jewelry, one given in love, the other returned in truth, seemed to belong together. In the following days I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. The anger that had once been sharp and consuming had dulled into something quieter, like an old scar that no longer ached. As December rolled in, Evan and I hosted a small gathering for friends from work and the community center project. The apartment was filled with laughter, the smell of cinnamon and music humming low in the background. At one point, I caught myself standing near the window, watching snow begin to fall over the river, and realized how different life had become. I wasn't the woman waiting for validation anymore. I had built my own peace and found people who reflected it back to me. Later that night, as the last guests left and the city outside settled into quiet, Evan came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "You're thinking about them again," he said softly. "A little," I admitted, "but not the way I used to." He pressed his chin against my shoulder. "That's progress." I smiled. "It is." The snow kept falling outside, slow and steady. Somewhere far beyond the city lights, my parents were facing the world they had built piece by piece. And while I couldn't change their path, I had finally learned how to let it exist, apart from mine. I turned off the lights, the soft blue reflection of the sapphire necklace still glimmering faintly from across the room. It reminded me of my grandmother's voice, calm and sure, telling me that love built on truth would always find its way home. That night, I slept deeply dreamless and untroubled for the first time in years. What waited beyond this season, I didn't yet know. But whatever it was, I was ready to meet it with the quiet strength she had taught me, steady, honest, and whole. Spring returned quietly the next year. The snow melted from the sidewalks along the Charles River, and the air carried that faint sweetness that only early April brings. Life had moved forward soft and steady. The chaos of the past had settled into memory, the kind that doesn't sting anymore, but lingers like the outline of an old scar-proof that healing took place. Evan and I had spent the winter focusing on what mattered. His firm had opened a new branch, and I had accepted a leadership role in a mentorship initiative for young women in tech. It felt right to turn what I'd learned, the quiet endurance, the lessons on boundaries, into something useful for others. I wanted to help women like me find their voices before the world taught them to stay silent. One evening after work, I walked home through the mild Boston air, passing the bookstore where I used to stop for tea. The sky was pale blue, streaked with gold, and for the first time in years I felt no pull to look back. My life was here, built by my own choices, one honest brick at a time. When I reached home, Evan was on the balcony sketching in his notebook. He looked up and smiled. "You're home early." "I took the long way," I said. "It felt good to walk." He closed his notebook and motioned me over. "You should see this," he said, flipping to a new page. It was a rough concept for a new project, a community center on the South End, designed with open glass spaces and gardens where people could gather. "I'm calling it the Whitaker Center," he added with a small grin. I looked at him, startled. "You're sure about the name?" "Completely," he said. "It's about what that name means now, not what it used to." His words hit me in a place I hadn't realized was still tender. I nodded, smiling through it. "Then I love it," I said. Later that night, as I tidied the living room, I noticed the two small jewelry boxes on the dresser, the necklace from my grandmother, and the locket my mother had sent. For a long moment, I just stood there. Both gleamed softly in the lamplight, one a symbol of truth reclaimed the other, a quiet gesture toward reconciliation. I picked up the locket and opened it, tracing the tiny photograph of my grandmother. I thought about how she'd lived steady, kind, never loud, but always sure of herself. Somehow, even years later, she'd still managed to guide me through every choice that mattered. Not long after, I received an email from Jenna. She'd written that my father's health was improving slowly and that Sophie had taken a full-time job at a small marketing firm. "They don't talk about the past much anymore," Jenna added. "But your mom keeps that locket picture of your grandmother on her nightstand." Reading those words, I felt a calm I hadn't known before. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need grand gestures. Knowing that they were finally sitting with their own truth, that was enough. Maybe some form of peace, however quiet, had reached them too. That weekend, Evan and I drove up to Maine, back to the same cabin we'd visited the year before. The sea was rougher this time, the waves loud against the rocks, but the sound was comforting. We spent the first night by the fire, sipping coffee and listening to the wind. At one point, I turned to him and said, It's strange, isn't it? How something that once felt like the end of the world just becomes part of your story. He smiled gently. That's what living does, he said. It turns pain into perspective. The next morning I walked along the shoreline, the wind tugging at my hair, the sand cool under my shoes. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn love that was never meant to be conditional, about how many times I'd chosen silence thinking it was peace when it was really fear, and about how somewhere along the way I'd learned that real peace doesn't come from being accepted, it comes from finally accepting yourself. The water shimmered in the sunlight, endless and steady. I picked up a smooth stone and tossed it into the waves, watching the ripples fade. It felt symbolic somehow, like leaving behind the last piece of a story that no longer needed retelling. When I turned back toward the cabin, I saw Evan waiting by the steps, waving for me to come inside. Behind him, smoke rose gently from the chimney, curling into the clear sky. It struck me then how beautiful ordinary life can be once you stop chasing approval and start living on your own terms. That night, as the tide came in and the stars blinked through the dark, I wrote a short note in my journal. It wasn't for anyone else, just a promise to myself, to keep choosing peace no matter how long it takes to find it. And maybe that's what the whole journey had been about. Justice hadn't meant winning or proving anyone wrong. It meant building a life so honest and full that the lies around me couldn't survive in it anymore. Now, whenever I see the reflection of that sapphire necklace in the light, I think less about what was taken and more about what I reclaimed the strength to walk away, the grace to let go, and the quiet dignity to keep going. Before I end this story, I'll say this. If you've ever carried the weight of being unseen, remember, you don't have to wait for anyone else to recognize your worth. Sometimes the greatest vindication comes from the peace you build in silence. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, to think about what peace might look like in your own life. And if you found even a little strength here tonight, I hope you'll stay and share it forward.